Welcome, everybody. I'm going to be walking you through my slides today on nutritional deficiencies in Peru. So let's get started. So the reason I picked this is because I've spent a decent amount of time in Peru and had a little bit of experience with the food and the culture and the medicine down there, and I wanted to dive a little deeper and see if I could find anything else about nutritional deficiencies and maybe a little bit about how we can help fix them. So first off, I wanted to just mention that obviously culture and food are interconnected. And that can be anything from types of food to the experiences shared around the food or the time of day that people are having these meals. All of these can play a role, so we'll talk about some of that today. So why Peru? Um, I was a missionary in Peru and obviously ate a lot of food while I was there, but a lot of that didn't play a role in what I have to do today. My wife and I actually went back down to Peru in 2019 to do an internship at a clinic down there. We were in northern Peru. This is obviously Machu Picchu, just for a visit. But we were up in the northern part of Peru where it is very, very different from Machu Picchu. It is sunny, hot, and there's no green anywhere. But lots of good people up there, and that's where we did our internship at the clinic. And what we did there was mostly mom, baby, and well child checks. So we spent a lot of time with pregnant moms. We spent a lot of time with little kids. So we got to know them really well, and we saw a lot of what the effects of these nutritional deficiencies can have on people. So the one big takeaway that I took from that experience was anemia. And before diving into it deeper, that was all I really knew, is that every day while we were down there, we were taking vitals, we were doing weights, head circumference, and we found that we did heel sticks on babies, we did blood draws on moms, and we did all kinds of checks on little kids, and about 50% of those kids were anemic. Everything else seemed to be fairly normal, not anything crazy like the anemia, but we did see that every day we had to tell moms, "Hey, your kid is anemic. This is serious." And a lot of times we had to tell pregnant ladies that hadn't had their babies yet, "You are anemic right now, and this could be affecting your baby." So it was something that we worked on a lot down there. So I wanted to dive in a little bit more and see what other kind of deficiencies were going on. That's what we'll talk about today. We'll talk about what could be causing that anemia and what other deficiencies might be affecting people. And then uncovering all of that doesn't do us a lot of good unless we know what the long-term consequences of those nutritional deficiencies are. And obviously, what can be done to correct the problem is our end goal. So, this is Peruvian food. I don't know how much you've heard about it, but Peru really is the culinary capital of South America. It has so much variety, and you can see all that here. One common thing you'll see on almost every plate is rice, as you can see here. So this picture shows lots of color, lots of plants, lots of protein, lots of rice, eggs, and this is what they want you to think of when you see Peruvian food, when you think of Peruvian food. And that really is what you'll get if you go out to eat as a tourist or if you're a local and you decide to go out for the night. But the actual day-to-day food looks a little more like this. You're going to have a big plate of rice. That is a staple with every meal, is a big plate of rice. And chicken. It's almost always chicken for the protein. And if you're lucky, you'll have a little bit of vegetables on the side. But chicken and rice is pretty much what you're going to eat in northern Peru every day, day in and day out. So there are pros and there are cons to this diet. And the pros are there's very little processed food. The rice is grown right there, and the chicken on your plate was probably alive this morning. The ingredients are very, very fresh and very, very low in fat, depending on how the rice is cooked. And it is all very cheap. That's why they eat it, is because financially it is a third world country. They are lower income, and food is hard to come by unless you're willing to eat just the rice and chicken. So the cons, obviously with the anemia, it's low in iron. The portions of chicken are small if they're there, and the rice is really the only other thing that they consistently eat day in and day out. Leafy greens are rare, which is kind of surprising to me because fruit is so abundant. There's fruit everywhere, all kinds. But the actual leafy greens are not grown up in northern Peru, and so it's pretty hard to come by. Lack of sanitation is going to be an issue anywhere. I didn't see any huge issues with that while we were at the clinic. Seemed like for the most part people were cooking the chicken appropriately, but just overall lack of sanitation in the medical field was pretty astounding. And one thing that we did note while we're down there is that a lot of kids were exclusively breastfed up to and even past 1 year sometimes. And while breastfeeding has amazing benefits, the exclusivity of it does lead to a little bit of deficiencies in kids. And so the last thing that I noted while we were down there of the diet is there was no dairy. Cheese, not a thing. Milk, not a thing. And so could be good, could be bad. I know there's lots of cons to dairy, but here in the United States, when we avoid dairy, we have other ways to make up for those good things that we do get from milks and cheeses. While down there, if they're exclusively eating that chicken and rice, they might be missing out on some of those things without the dairy. So these were the other major deficiencies that I could find while doing research. It wasn't very broad, but it is pretty significant that there's a pretty serious vitamin A deficiency, 15% of children, and a zinc deficiency of 25% in kids down there in Peru. And the last one I could find with more or less consistent numbers was a vitamin D or a calcium deficiency in 10 to 20% of kids down there. So this is probably the most important, well, it's the only chart I'm going to show you today, so it has to be the most important one. And it's the prevalence of anemia in women down there. And I want you to focus just on this line right here, this yellow one. That's pregnant women. And so the prevalence above 25% of anemia in pregnant women has short-term detrimental impacts on mom and potentially long-term detrimental impacts on the baby. So that is one of the unfortunate things that I was discovering. And just the overall trends that we were advancing really, really well in, I don't want to say eradicating, but at least decreasing the amount of anemia in both pregnant women and women in general in Peru until about 2015. And then that plateaued and even started to increase a little bit. That's something to keep an eye on. So the effects of maternal anemia on the baby is low birth weight, congenital anomalies, and failure to thrive. Among many others, these are the main ones that we saw while we were down there and that I could confirm with my research for this presentation. So once that baby's been born and once it's grown up a little bit, there are long-term effects of the anemia. And that is stunted growth, heart issues, liver issues, and cognitive impairment. Long-term effects of vitamin A deficiencies are blindness, as you know, immune deficiencies, and heart and lung problems. These aren't little things. These are very serious and very important to take care of. So the last thing I want to talk about today is how we can combat these things, how we can improve the quality of life in Peru based on nutrition. And so education is far and away the most important thing we can do. A lot of these things can be easily changed by a conversation. A lot of people down there don't have a lot of education, and so understanding that variation in diet is so important is part of education. Understanding that saving a little bit of money here and there so that we can have a little bit more protein with our meals is important. So I think the three biggest areas that we can adjust through education are government programs. There were very few government programs down there set up for people who maybe didn't have enough funding for food, couldn't afford it. So I think that that would be a good program to start down there. And then economic adjustments. I think that maybe a little bit of adjustment to the supply and demand of rice. Rice is so cheap. It's almost free, and that's why they eat so much of it, is because it costs nothing. And so maybe encouraging production of other resources so that they could have a little more variety in their diet would be beneficial. And then the last intervention that I thought of was medical intervention. And this is what we did a lot of times at the clinic. If moms were coming in week after week and we couldn't get those iron numbers up, what we would do is we would send them home with supplements because it's a little bit cheaper and it's a little bit easier if they're consistent than altering the entire course of how they feed their children. Okay, so feel free to reach out if anyone has any questions. I think that's it. Thanks, guys.